are mostly interested is what happened after the Gaza war, right? So what happened after the Gaza war is that right after the war started, right, the Israelis were trying to do what they did in every other countries. They are trying to push the Chinese to, in term of a political stance, to condemn the Al-Aqsa operation, which Al-Aqsa flood operation, which the Chinese refused. The Chinese use a very ambivalent type of tone, saying that, well, we condemn any violence against all civilians committed by any actors, and they just don't want to make any like pro-Israeli statement, and they just want to like make a more balanced and pro-peace type of statement, saying that, we just don't want to see civilians getting hurt, and that thing is the main stance of China on this on the October 7th issue, and Israelis were not happy with it because they were thinking that you have to be like the United States or Europe doing, and you have to condemn the organization by name, and you have to like use a very like one-sided supporting Israeli narrative. And the Chinese government continue not to do that, and there were a lot of like diplomatic conflicts going on in this era, and that also leads to, within Israel, there's an increasing number of interest groups trying to argue to the government, saying that we should basically like we should like strip China's investment away from the Haifa Bay port. We should just don't let the Chinese to continue run the Haifa Bay port because they don't support our war on Palestine. So that became a huge issue. And also when the Israeli aggression into southern Lebanon was going on, Haifa was quite unstable. So that again also like hurted the security of the Chinese investment there. The Chinese were the trade volume between China and Israel actually dropped a lot. Like that's the first drop ever since the 2013.
What happened next made it even clearer. Israeli interest groups began pressuring their government to punish China economically, especially around the Haifa Bayport project. That's a major strategic investment, and the fact that political disagreements nearly derailed it shows how fragile these alliances really are. Once Israel realized China wouldn't take its side in the Gaza conflict, sentiment turned cold almost overnight.
Report to the Israeli government, telling them that the Chinese were not on our board in our on the October 7th issue, but also like on the Gaza issue in general. And for that sake, we think that the Chinese are not in line with the national security of Israel, and we should just we should tear our statement, like our treaty with China. Like China and Israel signed this deal for like running the Haifa Bay port for like 25 years. And so basically he was arguing that we should like tear this apart. And that thing became very popular in Israel among the discussion. And besides that, the Israeli embassy also have been trying to do a lot of activities in Beijing, trying to basically like mobilize their friends in Beijing to force the Chinese government to condemn Hamas and to like take a more pro-Israel stance on the Gaza war. So that those things are the origin, I would say, the origin of China's diplomatic tension with Israel for the last 2 years.
But the pressure wasn't only inside Israel. The Israeli embassy in Beijing was aggressively lobbying behind the scenes, trying to mobilize business partners, political allies, even cultural figures, all in an effort to push China to condemn Hamas by name. It shows how badly Israel misread the moment. China doesn't bend to foreign pressure, and it certainly doesn't join Western-led narratives just to keep someone happy.
Talk about like, let's say, the grassroots, how the Chinese netizens reacted to this thing is that so after this round of the Gaza war started, like because it's the majority of the Chinese understand this thing as the continuation of this prolonged Arab-Israeli conflict, and especially Israeli aggression into the Palestinian land. And but the Israelis want to promote this idea as like October 7th is the beginning of the universe. All right, like nothing.
The singular moment where a completely, utterly peaceful, never ever having used its army before, Israel was suddenly out of the blue attacked by the most evil and vile terrorists that the world has ever seen.
Yeah, exactly. Like nothing existed ever before this day, and this day is the birth of universe. Like so that's the idea they are trying to promote. And very interestingly is that the Israeli embassy in China has been spreading misinformation. I would say, let's say, use a Trump term, fake news through this day, because one of the hostage taken by Hamas to Gaza, her name is Noah Argamani. Her mom is Chinese and she's Israeli citizen, not Chinese citizen at all. She was born in Israel, have nothing to do with China at all. But the Israeli embassy from the first day, they launched this fake news saying that this woman who was born in Beijing is now taken to Gaza as hostage, and trying to like appeal to the national sentiment of the Chinese masses. And after that, they continue to tweet things like this, saying like, "Oh, she's half Chinese. Her mom is worried about her. Netanyahu is worried about her. Netanyahu was so worried that he personally called the Chinese embassy to say like, if there's anything the Chinese can help with rescuing this half Chinese person out of Gaza and things like that." And first, this is fake news. I mean, like, of course, she is one of the hostages. That's true, but she's not born in Beijing. She has really nothing to do with China. And second is that when they're doing this propaganda, eventually because this thing become a huge deal that the Chinese foreign ministry get asked about this thing like for several times. And eventually what happened is that this slightly like, let's say, pro-Western stance Chinese media made an interview with the person's mom, which was the Chinese person, and she's Israeli citizen now. And what they figure out is that first she was one of the students that China sent out to study abroad, and then she just like tear off her agreement with the Chinese university and escaped to Israel and married an Israeli guy and never come back.
She never came back. So she was supposed to come back because she got a grant from
Yeah, because she take the scholarship from the Chinese I think the scholarship council or something, and that was in 1980s or like 1980s. So she's supposed to come back to work and like to finish that agreement, and basically she just tear parts of the agreement and never came back. And in that interview, she was quote unquote, she said this thing. She said, and the journalist was saying that, "Oh, people think that you are not Chinese citizen, and do you still have Chinese passports?" And like basically, the journalist was trying to help her to appeal to more Chinese netizens. And then she said the following, quote unquote, she says, I'm Israeli citizen, but does this mean that you Chinese don't have the duty to help me?" And that became the most disastrous propaganda I have ever seen. So after that, the Israeli embassy just never talk about this thing anymore because they feel like this is bad.
But the final blow was the mother's own words. When asked whether she was still a Chinese citizen, she said no, she is fully Israeli, but then added, "Does this mean you Chinese don't have the duty to help me?" That sentence hit a nerve. It came across as entitlement, not tragedy. It sounded like someone who rejected China long ago, but still expected China to rescue her when it became convenient. For many Chinese viewers, that wasn't just tone deaf, it felt insulting.
Absolutely. Like, I would say that, like, the Chinese young citizens today, like especially like those like who are using internet, the young netizens, they are probably the generation that has the the least favorable, or like let's say the most negative perceptions of Israel that ever since 1970s. And this is quite a huge change, because 1970s, that was very remote, that was Mao time, the Maoist era of China. And after 40 years of let's say different narratives about Israeli-Palestine issue, flourishing in China, and now people go back to like what they believed 40 years ago. Like this younger generation of China has I would say, the most negative perception of Israel, and also the narrative, like it's very common in China for people to compare Israel to the fascist regime of Japan during World War II.
Yeah.
And like, and also like often to Germany as well, which is a huge thing that would irritate Israelis and the entire West. But in China, we have a different aspect of political correctness. So this thing is not the untouchable taboo in China, and you would find that on Chinese internet, people often make those comparison of what the fascist Japan regime did during World War II, especially the Nanjing massacre, compare that to what the Israelis are doing in Gaza today. And sometimes they also like even compare what the Nazi Germany did in terms of genocide to what Israelis were doing in Gaza today. And that type of comparison sometimes also, let's say, gets incorporated within the government by like sometimes very high officials.
China's younger generation is seeing Gaza in real time, not through filtered government summaries, and what they see doesn't match Israel's narrative. That's why their perception of Israel is now the most negative it has been in 40 years.
What the Chinese foreign policy toward West Asia has been doing in the past is that there was this contradiction that existed in the Chinese foreign policy in that region, is that politically China is definitely like more close to Iran, and China needs Iran because like in terms of political strategy, you need a powerful anti-US regional power in the region to distract the United States so that the United States does not pour all of these resources into confronting China in East Asia, right? So that's the idea that China has been thinking. I think that's still the mainstream idea. But economically, because of the difficulty of trade with Iran and things like that, economically China has been quite dependent, like not dependent, but like heavily intertwined with the American allies in the region, like the Gulf states in particular, and sometimes also Israel. And the Chinese were seeing this thing as like for the last, like I think before the Gaza war, and also like before the Israel-Iran war, the Chinese were thinking that this thing can at least continue for a little while. They want to maintain this idea as like so-called everyone's partner in the region, and then they don't want to pick sides on regional wars and things like that.
They want to be neutral.
Yeah, like to stay neutral. And then like basically the Chinese government wants to imitate what Russia has been doing, because Russia was like largely like it was like saying that it was the friend of every major country in the region. So China was trying to do the same. But with what is happening the last 2 years, I think this thing is no longer going to continue. As I was talking about, even the Chinese investment in Israel cannot stand this type of geopolitical conflict, right? Like you think that you can invest in Israel while maintaining in close relationship with Iran. Like even the Israelis would not allow that thing to continue.
China's strategy in West Asia has always walked a tightrope, politically aligned with Iran, but economically tied to US allies. It was a balancing act designed to keep Washington distracted while China focused on East Asia, but Gaza exposed how fragile that balance really was.
It's a very interesting that for China, because like China, like the People's Republic of China emerged out of guerrilla warfare, right?
Yeah.
So the guerrilla warfare against the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, but also against Japanese invasion. So China's perception of like the word of like terrorism has a very like different take, I think, from like the West, well, at least from what the United States and Europe. So first, like China has made it very clear that armed struggle against occupation normally is not considered as terrorism in China, in Chinese diplomacy. And this is in the official document. Like, for example, I was mentioning that the Chinese representative, I think he's the director of the Chinese Department of Treaty and Law. He gave this speech in ICJ, and he was citing all the international laws and saying things. And he just want to make one point: is that people in the occupied territory has the rights of using armed struggle against the occupiers, and that was a huge thing of Chinese perception of armed struggle, and that thing continues from Mao era until today and never changed. Even when China's relationship with Israel was the closest to this thing, would never change, and the Chinese always recognize that Palestinians have the rights of armed struggle, and since I think because as we know, like China has close relationship with the PLA, with the PLO, and especially with Fatah. So, but even like on the view about, let's say, some like religious Palestinian organization like Hamas or the Islamist Jihad, the Chinese were just they still the official policy is not to label them as terrorist organization. In 2000, as early as 2003, when the Chinese official media interviewed Sheikh Yassin, the former leader of Hamas, they described this thing as armed organization or like resistant organization. And in 2016, that is under the current administration, under Xi Jinping's administration, the Xinhua News Agency, official media of China, published this stipulation telling people that how to use formal languages in news reports. And there's one particular clause saying that do not call Hamas a terrorist organization or extremist organization. So it doesn't mean that China loves Hamas, but means that at least China does not want to label that type of organization as a terrorist organization. But meanwhile, what the Chinese were mostly like sensitive about is religious extremism. So I think for the Hamas case, it's just like the Chinese feel like even we don't like their ideology, but we have some sort of sympathy towards the fact that there are people leaving occupied land. But with Giuliani, I think that's a very different case, and China has been quite skeptical and critical of the Giuliani government, like ever since very long time ago, especially because his relationship with the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement, which is listed not as a terrorist organization, not only within China, but also by the United Nations. So what the Chinese has been trying to do in the last a few months is that trying to like negotiate with Giuliani, saying that we can possibly recognize your administration and doing everything, but you need to make a promise of not cooperating with those figure, the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement terrorist again, and try to most preferable ideas to like return those people back to China. But even if that's not possible, just at least like trying to like you have to make a clear statement saying that you would not allow those organizations to use Syria as a base against China. That's the same thing what the Chinese did to Taliban after Taliban took power in Afghanistan, is that the Chinese are aware that Taliban in Afghanistan has a close relationship with Taliban in Pakistan, which is bombing Chinese investment in Pakistan often, and has some connections with the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement. So what the Chinese were like eventually did with Taliban is that even if we don't urge you to like return any of those figures to China, but like just don't allow them to do any activity against China in your territory. And in exchange for that, China was basically sending out economic aid and like improving trade with Afghanistan, even like after the Taliban took power. So yeah, so I think it's a very practical thing, and the Chinese are very, again, like very not conservative, but like sort of like inward looking in terms of a lot of international affairs, as long as an organization is not explicitly launching attack against China's own territory or like Chinese people abroad. The Chinese were like very flexible with it and like refrain from making moral judgments over this type of organizations and complexities.
This is where China's worldview really departs from the West. Because China was born out of guerrilla struggle, it sees resistance movements through a completely different historical lens. To Beijing, armed resistance under occupation isn't automatically terrorism, it's something written into their own revolutionary memory.